Okay, so for this set of lectures, we're going from the end of World War II to the quote-unquote end of the Cold War, which is really the ending of the Soviet Union in 1989. We're going to have three main themes for this time period. Obviously, there's a lot going on. Most importantly is that Professor Bloom is born within this time period, and I think that we could all commemorate that and as the most important thing to occur. So let's see here. The overall themes are going to be one, the Cold War, which is going to be the kind of overarching backdrop for the entire time period. That from the end of World War II to 1989, it's the Cold War that really is the ground under which Americans live, and really the world kind of lives at the time. A second theme is going to be affluence, how the United States becomes a ridiculously affluent society, that it becomes the 1% of the world, that people in the United States live, the average person in the United States will live better than kings and queens lived hundreds of years earlier. And finally, we're going to talk about various civil rights movements that are going to animate the time period, from African American rights to rights for women to rights for Native Americans, people with special needs, and even the Earth itself as having rights. So we're going to start right now with the Cold War. And there's kind of three main themes I want to talk about with the Cold War. One is ideology, and the ideology is kind of like overarching ideas of the world. Okay, ideology is an overarching view of how you see, of how a person or a group sees the world. The next is going to be technological developments and how those push both countries, and largely into real technological advancements, which are going to be pretty important in the ways that we live. And finally, geopolitics. That's the connection of geography to politics, how there's a real link between notions of space, physical space on the map, countries, and what their politics are. So let's start with ideology. So when World War II ends, and the United States and this group called the Soviet Union, which is a constellation of countries connected to Russia, we really see a ideological battle, a struggle between two different political economies. Okay, political economy is the relationship between your politics and your economics. The Soviet Union had a communist revolution earlier in the 20th century, and communism is the brainchild of largely two men, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, who had basically talked about trying to create a system where there was no more private property, where individuals didn't own land, the society did. And so all of the people owned all of the land and owned all of the goods, and then government would be representative of the people by having overall jurisdiction over the land. Now, the United States had come from a political ideology where individuals and organizations could own land and property. So this is really about who owns the land and who owns the property. And so in a business, for instance, the business owner owns the stapler that's made, not the person who's making the stapler, right? And in communism, the owner, there is no owner of the factory. Everyone is together in this to make the stapler, and it's the government, ideally elected by the people, that would then determine where those staplers go, how much people get food-wise, money-wise, etc. Now, part of this communism is that religion and religious systems are cloud people from the truth of how things should be. Okay, and so that led to a notion that communists are godless, Christianless, Jewishlessness, and you can see here on this cartoon, this comic book from the United States. It's called Treasure Chest. It's called This Godless Communism, and it starts with Karl Marx, and goes on to Vladimir Lenin and Joseph Stalin. Here's Karl Marx up here. And then the current leader, when this is produced, is Nikita Khrushchev. Now, the notion of a godless or an anti-Christian communism leads people in the United States to defend a number of ideologies. One is the ideology of private property, okay? And that your property rights, your rights to your land, your rights to owning things becomes really important, okay? So the quote-unquote, this is a free country starts to mean the notion of that you're free to own the things that you have. And also, this ideological struggle pushes the United States to really embrace a kind of overarching religion, that the United States is somehow, some way connected to God. What you see on the left here are $20 bills. One is from 1950. The other is from 1969. So the top one is from 1950. The bottom one is from 1969. And the thing you should notice, or I hope you notice the main difference, we're kind of playing a game of what's different in these images, is notice on the 1969 version it says, "In God We Trust." And on the top version it doesn't have that. Well, in the middle of the 1950s, Congress passed a law changing American currency to have the phrase, "In God We Trust," on its money. And nothing symbolizes the connection of and the difference to communism than the American ideology of that the United States is a godly country, follows God, and that private property is from God. That literally on the money of the country, right? Private property, money is something I have that you don't, which I then can exchange for things, says, "In God we trust." It's also the time in the 1950s when the phrase "one nation under God" enters the Pledge of Allegiance. It hadn't been there before that. And so this ideological struggle is going to be kind of at the heart of this kind of struggle between communism and the United States. And what that means is when these countries, when these groups have conflict, it's going to be bigger than just the conflict on the surface. That there's something deeper going on. That it's a battle of civilizations. It's a battle of how one views not only the world, but God. And so every time, if the communists take an action, it's going to be viewed as much bigger than just what's happening on the ground. And this is why things like the Olympics or sports even become really momentous, because it speaks to bigger issues at the heart of these civilizations. Now, another ideological idea that Americans have about communism is that communism wants to spread, that it has to spread, that it desires to spread. And so people in the United States have this desire to hold it back, or a policy known as containment, okay, which we'll talk about when we get to geopolitics. So now let's talk about technology. On the left, you see the first Sputnik satellite. So after World War II, and especially the detonating of the atomic bomb, there is a technological struggle, a technological race that happens between the United States and the Soviet Union, and that is to have technological advances which will not only help your society develop and grow, but will also advance military operations, because if you're going to have atomic weaponry, then if you're going to combat that, you're going to have lots and lots and lots of different military systems, maybe to stop those atomic bombs, maybe to create your own, maybe to create other types of weapons that can't be seen. You have to deliver, those atomic bombs. You have to get them from place to place. And so Sputnik is the first successful satellite, object sent from the globe out into space, and the Soviets do it first. Okay, and this leads to a space race where the ultimate kind of symbol of getting to space is to get a person on the moon, which the United States does before any other country, and you can see that photographed there on the right. And the space race, in part, is about weaponizing space, trying to find a way to use space and get machinery and things up there so that you can have a military advantage. It's also really profoundly important in the development of new technologies that, getting objects to space, getting communications to space is going to lead to revolutions here on this planet in how to get communications, how to send items, how to communicate, and this is how we're going to develop humans are going to develop the technologies that we have today, where we can communicate across the globe. We can actually get satellite feeds from things in space. We can see them on our computers, and this is all kind of at the base of it. Now, technologically, the Soviet Union catches up to the United States in lots of ways in the 1950s. It develops its own atomic weaponry. It's launching satellites and then people into space. And the United States is playing a little bit of catch up, and that leads to the United States government really trying to fund technological innovation, intellectual innovation, and this struggle with the Soviet Union leads to more federal government intervention in everyday life. Just as the New Deal had put the federal government in terms of like employing people, in terms of the president speaking, fireside chats, speaking to Americans. Now the federal government is investing significant money in the sciences. It's putting money into infrastructure development, like a new highway system, so that if you have to move nuclear missiles around the country, they can go on these big, huge highway systems, not just along small roads. That would be really, really dangerous. So there's whole lots of federal government intervention in different arenas of American society because of the Cold War. And also there's the fear of communists, traitors at home. There's a fear that there are communists within the United States who are going to give information to the Soviet Union, who are going to try to destabilize things within the United States. And so there's a push toward prove that you're an American. And there's even a House Un-Americans committee formed by Congress, so searching out people and organizations that are acting in a quote-unquote un-American way. And so it's un-American to be communist at the time. And so there's going to be people pursued, are you a spy? Are you doing things that are hindering, the development of the United States of America? So now geopolitics. So this is a map, this is kind of a Wikipedia map, around 1970 of influence, okay, and where societies have influence. And so the blue is largely where Americans and Western Europeans, where the notions of private property have influence. The red is where the Soviet Union has influence. The orange is where China has influence. And what the fear is by the 1950s and 1960s is that the Soviet Union, the red, wants to expand. Okay, and Americans come up with a theory of containment where they need to contain communism and the Soviets, and they also have a theory called a domino theory, that if one country falls, the countries near it may fall to communism as well. They'll kind of domino over. This is especially true in southeastern and northern Asia, where there's the fear that these kind of smaller countries, if a North Korea, for instance, or a Korea, or if a Vietnam falls, then subsequently other nations near it might become communist as well. And that leads in the 1950s and also 1960s United States military intervention into first Korea and then into Vietnam and southern Asia. There's also this island country called Cuba, which has a communist revolution and has a good relationship with the Soviet Union. And in the 1960s, there's an American fear that the Soviets might try to put atomic weaponry here in Cuba, which would mean it would be quite easy for the Cubans or the Soviet Union to launch atomic weaponry at the United States. when you have your missiles here in the Soviet Union, it's hard to get them across the Pacific. This is actually really far. This map, really far distance, unless they be a little easier to bomb Alaska. But so the notion of that there might be these weapons leads to a real critical inflection point in the middle of the early 1960s, where the United States and the Soviet Union leadership are really looking at each other like there might be a World War III with nuclear explosives, and ultimately the United States, the Soviet Union takes its missiles out of Cuba, and the United States takes missiles out of Turkey, which basically is kind of an agreement to pull atomic weaponry back, to not have it. The Cubans didn't actually have the missiles, but the Soviets were trying to get them there. So these the Cold War ideology, Cold War technology, and Cold War geopolitical struggles are really the backdrop, the underpinning for the next two topics we're going to talk about, affluence and civil rights.